In the most ancient of times, when the sons of men multiplied upon the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, something occurred that would forever alter the destiny of humanity itself. The veil between heaven and earth grew thin, and through that gossamer boundary came beings of terrible beauty and infinite corruption. The watchers, angels who had abandoned their sacred posts in the celestial realm to gaze with lustful eyes upon the daughters of men. These were not mere spirits of temptation, but mighty princes of heaven who had once stood in the very presence of the Almighty, their wings spanning distances that could cover mountains, their voices capable of commanding the elements themselves. Yet in their rebellion, they cast aside their celestial glory for earthly desires, descending from their lofty stations like falling stars burning through the darkness of night. The leader among them was Azazel, whose name meant God strengthens, though he had long since turned his divine strength against his Creator. Tall beyond mortal comprehension, with eyes like burning coals and a voice that could shake the foundations of mountains, he led 200 of his fellow watchers in their descent to earth. With him came Semjaza, master of enchantments, whose whispered words could bend the will of mortals like reeds in a hurricane. There was Barakul, who taught the forbidden arts of astrology and weather manipulation, and Kokabel, who revealed the secret names of the stars and their influences over human fate. When these celestial beings took wives from among the daughters of men, the earth itself trembled at the violation of divine order. The union of the divine and mortal was never intended by the Creator, for it would produce offspring that belonged neither fully to heaven nor to earth, beings caught between two worlds, cursed by their very existence. And so were born the Nephilim, whose very name meant the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. These were not merely large men, but giants whose proportions defied the natural order established by God. The smallest among them towered 15 feet above the ground, while the mightiest reached heights of 30 feet or more, their massive forms casting shadows that could engulf entire villages. Their strength was not merely physical but supernatural, inherited from their angelic fathers. A single Nephilim could uproot oak trees with his bare hands, hurl boulders the size of houses across valleys, and crush stone to powder with his grip. Their skin bore an otherworldly pallor, sometimes appearing almost translucent under moonlight, revealing the inhuman ichor that flowed through their veins instead of common blood. Their eyes blazed with an inner fire that betrayed their celestial heritage, changing color with their moods, burning gold when enraged, pale silver when calculating, deep crimson when consumed with bloodlust. Their voices carried unnatural authority, compelling obedience even from those who wished to resist, for they bore within them echoes of the divine word that had spoken creation into existence. But it was not merely their physical might that made the Nephilim terrible to behold. Their fallen angelic fathers taught them secrets that were never meant for mortal minds, the arts of metallurgy that could forge weapons capable of cutting through stone, the knowledge of warfare that turned every conflict into a massacre, the practices of sorcery that could summon storms and plague, and the forbidden wisdom of genetic manipulation that allowed them to breed abominations unknown to nature. Under their influence, the world began to transform into something monstrous. The Nephilim established themselves as kings and gods over the scattered tribes of humanity, demanding worship and tribute from mortals who had no choice but to submit or perish. They built great cities of black stone, their architecture defying conventional engineering with towers that seemed to scrape the very belly of heaven, supported by geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate. In these dark citadels, the Nephilim held court like demonic royalty, surrounded by their human slaves and their hybrid offspring, creatures that were part human, part giant, and wholly corrupt. They demanded the most beautiful women as concubines, the strongest men as gladiators for their amusement, and the wisest as servants to unlock even more forbidden knowledge. Their appetites were as vast as their bodies, consuming not just food and drink in quantities that could feed entire villages, but also indulging in every form of depravity that their twisted minds could conceive. The giant Og of Bashan, whose iron bedstead measured 13.5 feet in length, was considered among the smaller of their kind. His fortress controlled the trade routes between the great rivers, and from its walls he would hurl massive stones at any caravan that refused to pay his tribute, stones so large they could crush a dozen men at once. Yet even Og trembled before the true lords of the Nephilim, giants so immense that they could stride across rivers without the water reaching their knees, whose footsteps left craters in solid rock. The giant Goliath, who would later terrorize the armies of Israel, was merely a descendant of these original Nephilim, his bloodline diluted by generations of human intermixing, yet still he stood over 9 feet tall and wore armor that weighed more than a normal man. If such a diminished offspring could strike terror into the hearts of seasoned warriors, What must the original giants have been like when they walked the earth in all their terrible glory? But the corruption spread far beyond the physical realm. The Watchers taught humanity arts that were meant to remain hidden until the proper time in God's plan. Azazel revealed the secrets of making swords and shields, spears and breastplates, teaching men not just to kill, but to make an art of slaughter. He showed them how to mine precious metals and craft jewelry, introducing vanity and materialism where once there had been simple contentment with God's provision. Semjaza taught the art of cutting roots and binding spells, showing how to manipulate the spiritual realm for earthly gain. Under his tutelage, the first sorcerers learned to communicate with demons, to cast curses that could wither crops or plague their enemies with disease, to brew potions that could enslave the will or poison the mind. Barakel corrupted the pure science of astronomy, turning it into the practice of astrology, teaching men to worship the stars rather than their creator and to believe that their destinies were written in the movements of celestial bodies rather than in the will of God. Through his influence, the first pagan temples were erected, their altars running red with blood as humans began to sacrifice their own children to appease the cosmic forces they believed controlled their fate. Kokabel revealed the secret names of the constellations and their supposed influences over human affairs, while Erekiel taught the signs of the earth, how to read omens in the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the entrails of sacrificed animals. Each forbidden lesson drew humanity further from their creator and deeper into spiritual darkness. As generations passed under the dominion of the Nephilim, the world became unrecognizable from the paradise God had originally created. Violence became the natural order, with the strong preying upon the weak without mercy or restraint. The very concepts of justice and compassion began to fade from human memory as society reorganized itself around the principle of might makes right. The Nephilim established fighting pits where humans were forced to battle to the death for their amusement, great coliseums where the screams of the dying provided music for their feasts. They instituted fertility cults that demanded the sacrifice of infants, their blood offered to demonic entities that promised power and prosperity to their worshippers. Cities became places of perpetual violence, where murder was commonplace and the weak were consumed by the strong without consequence. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the genetic experiments conducted by these fallen beings. Not content with corrupting humanity alone, they began to interfere with all of creation, producing hybrid monsters that violated every boundary God had established. They bred giants with multiple heads, creatures that were part human and part beast, abominations that could not be sustained by nature and required constant feeding of human flesh to survive. Ancient texts speak of chimeras that combine the worst aspects of different animals. Creatures with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, the tail of a serpent, and the face of a man, all animated by intelligence that was purely malevolent. They created beings that were part plant and part animal, trees that could move and hunt, flowers that could sing men to their doom with voices like sirens. The corruption extended even to the fundamental building blocks of life itself. Where God had created each species to reproduce, after its kind, the Nephilim introduced chaos and abomination, creating beings that violated every natural law. The earth groaned under the weight of these perversions, and the very sky seemed to darken as creation itself recoiled from the horror of what had been done to it. In this dark age, righteousness became almost extinct. The pure lineage of Seth, the appointed son through whom God's promises would flow, grew ever smaller as corruption spread like a plague through humanity. Many who had once walked with God found their hearts growing cold, their prayers less frequent, their faith wavering in the face of such overwhelming evil. Yet there remained a remnant, a small group of faithful souls who refused to bow the knee to the Nephilim or participate in their abominations. These righteous few were led by Enoch, a man who walked so closely with God that he was eventually taken from the earth without experiencing death, translated directly into the presence of the Almighty as a testimony that faith could triumph even in the darkest times. Enoch's prophecies warned of coming judgment, declaring that God would not forever allow his creation to be corrupted. He spoke of a day when the Almighty would come with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all the ungodly, to convict all who were ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they had committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners had spoken against him. But the Nephilim laughed at such warnings. In their arrogance, they believed their strength made them immune to divine judgment. They had seen no consequences for their rebellion, no punishment for their corruption of creation. Each passing year only seemed to confirm their power and immortality. Some among them began to claim divinity for themselves, demanding that humans worship them as gods, building temples where their massive statues received daily sacrifices of food, wealth, and human lives. The greatest of the Nephilim established himself as king over all others, ruling from a city built entirely of black stone that seemed to absorb light itself. His name was spoken only in whispers, for to say it aloud was said to summon his attention, and his attention meant death for any who were not worthy to stand in his presence. His palace was a testament to blasphemy, its walls carved with images that mocked the works of God, its halls echoing with the screams of those who had displeased him. From his dark throne, he issued decrees that plunged the world ever deeper into depravity. He commanded that all children born with unusual marks or abilities be brought to him, for he sought to breed a race of servants who would combine human intelligence with inhuman strength and complete loyalty to his will. He established schools where young humans were taught to worship power above all else, to see compassion as weakness and cruelty as strength. Under his influence, the concept of family began to dissolve. Children were encouraged to betray their parents, spouses to murder each other for advantage, siblings to compete in deadly combat for inheritance. The bonds of love and loyalty that God had woven into the fabric of human society were systematically destroyed and replaced with fear, hatred, and brutal self-interest. But high above in the heavens, the cries of the innocent had not gone unheard. The archangel Michael brought before the throne of the Almighty the accumulated testimonies of every act of violence, every innocent death, every corruption of divine design. The prayers of the faithful remnant rose like incense, mixed with the blood of martyrs who had died rather than participate in the abominations of the Nephilim. And God looked down upon the earth and saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The corruption was so complete that it grieved him to his heart that he had made man on the earth. The beautiful world he had created, which he had once declared very good, had become a hell's cape where evil was celebrated and righteousness was persecuted. But there was one man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Noah, a descendant of the righteous line of Seth, who had remained faithful despite being surrounded by corruption on every side. Noah was perfect in his generations, meaning his genetic line remained pure, uncontaminated by the hybrid offspring of the Watchers. More importantly, he was righteous in his conduct, walking with God as his ancestor Enoch had done. To Noah came the word of the Lord, a command that must have seemed impossible to fulfill. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. The ark was to be a massive vessel, far larger than any ship that had ever been built, designed not for navigation but for survival. It would need to house not only Noah's family but also representatives of every clean and unclean beast, every bird of the air, every creeping thing that crept upon the earth. Most importantly, it would serve as a refuge for the pure genetic lines that God intended to preserve through the coming catastrophe. As Noah began his monumental task, laboring day and night for years to complete the ark according to God's specifications, the Nephilim and their human subjects watched with amusement. Here was this old man, building a massive boat in a land far from any large body of water, claiming that God would flood the entire world. To them, it was the ultimate proof of human delusion and weakness. The Nephilim's mockery grew more intense as the years passed and no flood materialized. They sent their servants to harass Noah and his family, stealing materials, destroying completed sections, threatening violence against anyone who helped with the construction. Some of the giants personally visited the building site, their massive forms towering over the ark itself, laughing at the presumption that such a vessel could survive any catastrophe they could not. But Noah persevered, driven by unwavering faith in God's word and the knowledge that judgment was not delayed but appointed for the proper time. He preached righteousness to his generation, warning them of the coming flood, pleading with them to repent and turn from their evil ways. For his efforts, he was ridiculed as a madman, threatened with death, and ultimately ignored by all but his own family. Even as the ark neared completion, the world around it continued to spiral deeper into corruption. The Nephilim, secure in their apparent invincibility, pushed the boundaries of abomination even further. They began experimenting with their own forms, seeking to transcend their hybrid nature and become fully divine. Some attempted to open portals to other dimensions, seeking to bring forth entities that would make even their fallen fathers seem benign by comparison. The final provocation came when the greatest of the Nephilim declared himself not merely a god, but the God, demanding worship from the remnant of faithful humans who had steadfastly refused to bow to any but the Creator. When they refused, he ordered their execution, planning a great sacrifice that would demonstrate his power over the God of heaven by destroying all who served him. It was then that the windows of heaven opened and the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The rain began not as droplets but as torrents, as if the very oceans above had been released upon the earth. The ground cracked open, releasing subterranean waters that had been held in check since creation. Within hours, the valleys began to fill, and by the end of the first day, even the hills were beginning to disappear beneath the rising waters. The Nephilim's reaction was swift and predictable. They gathered their forces and marched toward higher ground, confident that their supernatural strength would allow them to survive what mere humans could not. The greatest of them waded into the rising waters, using their massive height to remain above the flood level, carrying their human servants on their shoulders like living towers. But as the waters continued to rise, reaching heights that covered even the highest mountains, the terrible reality began to dawn on them. This was not merely a natural disaster that could be overcome through strength or cunning. This was divine judgment, and no created being could stand against the creator of the universe. One by one the giants began to fall. Their supernatural strength, which had made them masters of the earth, proved useless against the inexorable rise of the waters. Those who had terrorized humanity for generations found themselves drowning like any other mortal creature, their final moments filled with the bitter realization that their rebellion had led them not to godhood, but to destruction. The ancient texts speak of their desperate attempts to survive, how they tried to build great rafts and towers, how they fought each other for the highest remaining peaks, how some attempted to use their sorcery to part the waters as Moses would later do at the Red Sea. But all their efforts were in vain, for this judgment came not from any earthly power they might manipulate, but from the throne of the Almighty Himself. As the last of the giants disappeared beneath the waters, their death cries echoing across the drowned world, a profound silence settled over the earth. The violence that had characterized human existence for so long was finally ended, the corruption that had spread like cancer through creation was washed away, and the abominations that had violated the natural order were swept into oblivion. But death was not the end for the Nephilim. Their bodies perished in the waters of the flood, but their spirits, being part angelic and therefore not subject to the same natural laws as human souls, became trapped between dimensions, neither able to return to heaven from which they had been expelled, nor able to find rest in death as humans could. These disembodied spirits became what later generations would know as demons, evil spirits that wander the earth seeking bodies to inhabit, desperate to experience physical sensation once again. These demonic spirits retained their superhuman intelligence and their knowledge of forbidden arts, but they were stripped of the physical power that had made them so formidable. Instead, they became masters of deception and manipulation, influencing human behavior from the shadows, inspiring the same sins and rebellions that had characterized their physical existence. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain continued, and the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days, ensuring that every trace of the corrupted civilization was buried beneath the waves. When the waters finally began to recede and the ark came to rest upon Mount Ararat, Noah and his family emerged into a world that was both familiar and utterly transformed. Gone were the great cities of black stone, the towers that had scraped the heavens, the genetic abominations that had crawled and flown across the landscape. Gone too were the libraries of forbidden knowledge, the weapons that could level mountains, the magical artifacts that had given mortals power over supernatural forces. The earth was clean again, washed pure by divine judgment, ready for a new beginning. But the memory of the Nephilim remained, preserved in the stories that Noah's descendants would tell around their fires, passed down through generations as both history and warning. These tales served to remind humanity of what could happen when divine boundaries were crossed, when the lust for power overcame reverence for God, when strength was used to oppress rather than protect. The story of the giants who defied God became a cornerstone of human mythology, appearing in cultures across the world in various forms. The Greeks spoke of titans who warred against the gods, the Norse told of frost giants who threatened the realm of men, and countless other civilizations preserved memories of a time when mighty beings ruled the earth before being destroyed by divine intervention. Archaeological evidence continues to surface that may support these ancient accounts. Massive stone structures that seem impossible to build with primitive tools, skeletal remains of unusually large humans, and artifacts that suggest advanced knowledge existing in supposedly primitive times. While mainstream science offers alternative explanations for these findings, they serve as intriguing reminders that our understanding of prehistoric humanity may be incomplete. The theological implications of the Nephilim account continue to resonate through religious thought today. The story raises profound questions about the nature of free will, the extent of divine patience, and the ultimate consequences of rebellion against God. It demonstrates that neither supernatural power nor human intelligence can ultimately prevail against divine justice, and that corruption, no matter how pervasive, will eventually face judgment. Most importantly, the account of the Nephilim serves as a warning for every generation, that when humanity abandons its relationship with the Creator in pursuit of power and pleasure, when the strong exploit the weak without restraint, when corruption becomes so normalized that righteousness seems foolish, judgment will inevitably follow. The only question is whether there will be found on earth those who, like Noah, remain faithful despite being surrounded by corruption on every side. In the end, the story of the Nephilim is not merely ancient history but a mirror held up to every age, reflecting the eternal conflict between good and evil, between submission to divine authority and rebellion against it. It reminds us that no earthly power, no matter how mighty, can stand against the justice of God, and that those who walk humbly with their Creator will find grace even in the midst of judgment. The giants who defied God are gone, their mighty works reduced to dust, their names remembered only as warnings to future generations. But their spiritual legacy lives on in the ongoing struggle between light and darkness, in every choice between righteousness and rebellion, in every decision to use power to build up or to tear down. And in that struggle, the lesson of the Nephilim remains as relevant today as it was in the days of Noah, that judgment deferred is not judgment denied, and that every knee will eventually bow before the throne of the Almighty.